For more on this discussion, we're now joined by Media Monitoring Africa Director William Bird, and he joins us via our video link to unpack this conversation a bit more further. William, thank you so much for joining us this evening here in SABC News. I mean, you know, the first question here, why are we seeing less and less people firstly applying for these broadcasting licenses and even lesser, even being approved for them?
Well, good evening. If you go and look back over the last couple of years, you'll see that the number of applications for community licenses has actually decreased quite a lot. But still, the number of successful applicants has actually remained incredibly low. So I think in 2020, it was something like over 500 applications for licenses, and then ICASA had a pause in their license fee processing, and we've then seen that kind of starting to ramp up again, but you have seen a decrease overall in the number of applications. That said, what we're still seeing is very few of these applicants being successful. Now that leads to all sorts of questions. We understand from ICASA that they've said they've done workshops on these things, and that obviously is a key and important part of it. But why is it that we're getting so few applicants? Is it because none of them are just up to scratch, or is there something about the application process itself that makes it prohibitive for community media to be trying to make these particular applications?
One would ask, do we attribute this to the rise of social media and online platforms? I mean, these days, a lot of people have podcasts on YouTube, and they are speaking directly to their audiences, and it's a much more easier a process for them. I mean, you don't have to go through the stringent measures that you would have to go through via ICASA. Would you blame it on that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think certainly we know that not sure why that was a graphic we were looking at, but certainly we do know that social media is having a significant impact on how people access news. But if you look globally, you'll see that radio, particularly community media, radio, especially, globally, is seeing a resurgence. So it's not something that is necessarily going to go away, and that's because it serves and meets a particular range of needs, either a community of interest or a geographic community that is able to speak and address particular issues that social media doesn't do. The other thing is that despite social media playing an increasing role, data remains prohibitively expensive. We know from the ASO debate that over a third of South Africans still rely exclusively on analog. We know that the majority of listeners for radio in South Africa are listening in African languages to the SABC services and channels. That's not an environment that says community media is irrelevant or that community media is dying. If you look at the small commercial publishers, for example, they're struggling not because they aren't relevant, but because the economic model has fallen apart directly because of the impact of digital. So digital is impacting, there's no doubt about it. But I think what we have to be looking at is saying, what is it about community, particularly communities, either the communities of interest that are making applications and they're just not being successful? Because if you read and look at some of the stories, we know that some community media are actually taking ICASA to court because they're saying that their processes are unreasonable, that they seem to be looking to catch them out rather than to help them out.
What does this say then about, community broadcasting platforms in South Africa?
Well, we know that, like just about every other broadcasting platform, they're really struggling. We're moving into a digital era. We know that SABC has lost significant amount of its audience because of the analog switch off, and the funding models for these things just aren't there. So, but that said, we also know that there's still a very high level of interest and demand for genuine community broadcasting, whether it's television or whether that's radio. And that's because community TV and community radio does something that those other media can't do. It's there, it's embedded in communities. You have people there telling stories that are relevant immediately to that particular community and highlighting that they've got an approach, and there's a lot of relevance, and if it's done well, there's a high level of ownership and a real sense of building of community. And that's something quite very, very different to what social media does, right? Social media doesn't tend to build communities. It tends to isolate you as the reader, as the user of that particular device. Everything is tailored to you in your echo chamber, whereas community media builds community. Community media does something quite different, and in fact, that's what general journalistic media does. So we are in a conflict at the moment between these two kind of very, very different medium, but that doesn't mean that community media is irrelevant. What it does mean is that we need to find better ways of making sure that those who have a genuine interest in it are actually able to get their licenses and through the system.
What needs to change, to allow more people to actually access community broadcasting licenses? I mean, clearly there is still a demand for community broadcasting. Like you're saying, I mean, there are some people who don't have access to data, and data is expensive, and there's no community when it comes to the online platforms, so what needs to change?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. The first is that ICASA needs to have a serious review of their systems and understand why it is that they are getting, despite the wealth and huge amount of applications they're getting, why so few are actually successful in going through to that next stage. And that, to a degree, looks as though it's a kind of a system that's based on a weeding out and not on a trying to build up and allow and promote access. And you have to find a balance of these things, because you don't just want the chances. You're going to spend a lot of time and energy of ICASA and of their community when they've got no real intention of producing something for that community. Equally, you do want to make sure that those who've not done this before, who really don't have necessarily the skills, the access and the capacity, in many instances, you want to make sure that you give them every opportunity to be successful in their application. So that's on that side. I think on the flip side of that, we're seeing globally these moves to be saying, how do we make sure that the big, very large social media operators are able to make some kind of meaningful contribution to helping sustain journalism and local journalism particularly. So we are seeing those kinds of topics coming up again globally. These aren't challenges that are unique to South Africa, and I'm not sure that anyone's really cracked a number of really good enough answers yet. But what we do have to do is say we're in Africa, and in South Africa in particular, we've got to find solutions that are going to work for us. And that means we're going to have to try and be a little bit creative. But sadly, what we're seeing from government isn't any level of creativity. If you look at the most recent draft of the audio content services white paper, it's taken us several steps back. So part of, again, what we need, in addition to ICASA sorting their things out, is for governments to actually approach and look and try and build a genuine vision around what these media can and should be contributing to. We know with the SABC bill, which is just a broad embarrassment and should be removed immediately, that there's no vision and no thinking that's been given to how we take the SABC forward, let alone small commercial and community media. So frankly, this is a crisis, and the only good thing about a crisis is that there's several opportunities in there to actually build something really positive and exciting.
William, thank you so much for your contribution. That is William Bird. He is the Director for Media Monitoring Africa.